There's footage that exists right now, sitting on a server somewhere in a Greenville, South Carolina police department that nobody outside law enforcement has seen. Not grainy security camera footage from an apartment complex hallway. Something more direct than that. A body camera, worn by the responding officer, recording in real time, capturing whatever that room actually looked like in the minutes after Hayden Panettiere was found unresponsive. I want to start there today because I think it's the piece of this story that's gotten the least attention relative to how much it actually matters. Everyone's talking about the redacted police report. Everyone's talking about the DEA. But there's a specific, confirmed piece of evidence, footage, not paperwork, that exists, that we know exists, and that has not been made public. And I think sitting with that fact carefully tells us something about where this investigation actually stands, 6 days after it began. Let me walk through what's actually documented here, because this case has moved fast, and I think it's worth slowing down and getting the sequence right. Hayden Panettiere died on Sunday, August 16th, 2026. She was 36. According to a police incident report obtained by NBC News, heavily redacted but real and confirmed by multiple outlets independently, she went into cardiac arrest at an apartment complex in Greenville, South Carolina, called Judson Mill Lofts. The responding officer is identified in that report as Matthew Brian, and according to what's documented, Brian was wearing a body camera throughout the entire emergency response. That footage exists. It captured whatever happened in that room during the response. It has not been publicly released. I want to be precise about what that means and doesn't mean, because I think this is exactly the kind of detail that gets flattened into something more sinister than it actually is, if you're not careful with it. Police departments generally don't release body camera footage from an active death investigation while that investigation is still open. That's standard practice, not evidence of concealment. Releasing footage prematurely can compromise an investigation, can be genuinely traumatic for family members who haven't consented to its release, and in cases where a cause of death hasn't been formally determined yet, can create exactly the kind of public speculation that makes an already difficult investigation harder to conduct properly. So, no, I don't think the fact that this footage hasn't been released yet is, on its own, evidence that anyone's hiding something. What I do think is worth examining is everything else that has been released, because piece by piece it's building a picture that's genuinely hard to look away from, even without the footage itself. Let's start with who was actually in that apartment. Brian Hickerson, Panettiere's on-again, off-again boyfriend, was there. According to the police report, he and his brother, Zach Hickerson, were both at the scene. Brian and Zach's own account, given to TMZ through a statement, says Zach went to check on the couple after not hearing from them that Sunday morning and found Hayden unresponsive. Brian, according to that same account, then administered Narcan, the opioid overdose reversal medication, through her nose, trying to revive her before paramedics arrived. I want to sit with that detail for a second, because I think it complicates the story in a way that's genuinely important to acknowledge, rather than skip past. If that account is accurate, Brian Hickerson attempted, in a moment of crisis, to save her life. That's not a small thing. That's not the behavior of someone indifferent to what was happening. Whatever else is true about this situation, that specific detail, reaching for Narcan, trying to reverse whatever was happening to her body in that moment, deserves to be held alongside everything else we're about to discuss, not erased by it. But here's where the documented record gets more complicated, and it comes directly from the police report itself, in the words of the responding officer. I observed Zach to be very emotional while EMS were working on Hayden. Officer Brian wrote. Brian did not become emotional until EMS declared her officially deceased. I've read that sentence more times than I probably should have this week, because I think it captures something that true crime audiences instinctively lean toward. Behavioral analysis, reading emotional response as a window into what someone actually knew or felt. And I want to be honest with you about both sides of that instinct, because I think it's important to hold them together rather than picking the one that makes a cleaner story. On one hand, that's a specific, documented observation from a trained officer, made in real time, not reconstructed after the fact. It wasn't Brian's brother saying this. It wasn't a neighbor or a stranger with an axe to grind. It was the police officer who responded to the scene, choosing to include that specific behavioral detail in an official report. Officers don't typically note something like that unless it struck them as notable enough to document. On the other hand, and I think this matters just as much, trauma responses vary enormously between people, and delayed emotional reaction is genuinely well documented in crisis psychology. Some people go numb in the moment and fall apart later. Some people focus entirely on the practical task in front of them, administering Narcan, talking to paramedics, answering questions, and the emotional weight of what's happening doesn't fully land until the moment is over and there's nothing left to actively do. TMZ's separate reporting, through Zach's statement, described Brian as becoming visibly emotional once efforts to save her had ended. That's consistent with both readings. It's consistent with delayed shock. It's also, I'll be honest, consistent with something else entirely, and the officer's report doesn't resolve which one it was. It just documents what was observed. I don't think I can tell you which explanation is correct. I don't think anyone watching this video can, from the outside, based on a redacted paragraph in a police report. What I can tell you is that it was significant enough for a trained officer to write down, unprompted, as part of an official record. That's not nothing. It's also not proof of anything specific. It's a documented data point, sitting in the same uncomfortable space so much of this case currently occupies. Now let's talk about the bag of medication, because I think this is where the story starts connecting to something larger. According to the same police report, Brian Hickerson showed officers a bag of medications that Panettiere had been taking. The report documents this. What it doesn't do, because the names have been redacted entirely throughout the public version of this document, is tell us what was actually in that bag. I want to explain why that redaction matters, because I don't think it's automatically sinister, and I also don't think it's nothing. Medical information is generally protected, even in the context of a police report tied to a death investigation, particularly before a cause of death has been formally and publicly confirmed. Redacting specific medication names while a toxicology investigation is ongoing is, again, fairly standard practice. You don't want specific substance names circulating publicly and shaping public narrative before an official determination has actually been made. But here's what changes the shape of this specific redaction, and it's not speculation. It's a confirmed fact reported independently by ABC News, NBC News, and multiple other outlets. On Wednesday, 3 days after Panettiere's death, the Drug Enforcement Administration formally joined the investigation. The DEA doesn't typically involve itself in routine death investigations. Their jurisdiction is specifically tied to controlled substances, how they were obtained, whether they were legally prescribed, whether federal drug trafficking or distribution laws might have been violated somewhere in the chain between a prescription being written and a substance actually reaching someone. Their involvement here tells you something concrete about the direction investigators are looking. even without a single name in that redacted bag being made public. The Greenville City Police Department remains the lead agency on this investigation, with the DEA specifically assisting rather than taking over. That distinction matters. This isn't, as of right now, a case where federal authorities have seized control of the investigation. It's a local department continuing to lead, while bringing in specialized federal expertise to examine one specific thread: the medication, its source, and whether anything about how Panettiere obtained or was administered those substances involved a violation of federal law. The Greenville County Coroner's Office, for its part, completed an autopsy the Monday after her death. Their statement was specific. No signs of trauma were discovered that would have contributed to her death. I think that detail deserves real weight because it directly addresses one category of question. This doesn't appear, based on the physical examination, to have involved any kind of physical violence in that final moment. Cause and manner of death remain officially pending, awaiting further investigation, which almost certainly means toxicology results that, like most comprehensive tox screens, can take weeks to fully process. So, where does that leave us? An autopsy that found no signs of trauma, a bag of medication with every name redacted, the DEA joining a local investigation specifically focused on controlled substances, a boyfriend who, according to his brother's account, tried to revive her with Narcan, and who, according to a police officer's documented observation, didn't show visible emotion until the moment paramedics declared her dead, and body camera footage that captured all of it in real time that the public hasn't seen. I want to bring in one more piece of context here, because I don't think this story can be told honestly without it, even though I understand why some coverage has chosen to leave it out. Brian Hickerson and Hayden Panettiere had a long, well-documented, publicly complicated relationship. They began dating in 2018. That relationship, at multiple points over the following years, became the subject of actual domestic violence cases. Not internet speculation, not tabloid rumor, but documented legal proceedings that were covered by mainstream outlets at the time they occurred. I think that history matters here, and I want to be careful about exactly how it matters, because I think this is precisely where a lot of coverage of this case risks going somewhere irresponsible. A documented history of domestic violence in a relationship doesn't automatically tell you anything about the specific circumstances of someone's death years later. People with histories of conflict in a relationship aren't automatically suspects in every subsequent tragedy connected to that person. That's not how evidence works, and it's not how I want to approach this story. What that history does do, I think, is provide context for why investigators, and honestly why the public, might be paying closer attention to Brian Hickerson's specific actions and reactions in the hours surrounding Hayden's death than they might for someone with no documented history at all. It's not proof of anything. It's context that makes careful, evidence-based scrutiny reasonable, rather than something to dismiss as baseless speculation. Brian's attorney, Sloan Ellis, notably a former federal prosecutor who has worked directly with both the DEA and FBI on past cases, which is a detail worth sitting with, given exactly which federal agency has now joined this investigation, released a statement on Brian's behalf. I want to quote it directly because I think the specific wording matters. Hayden's death remains under investigation, and it is important to allow that investigation to proceed. As has been publicly reported, police confirmed there were no signs of foul play. Out of respect for Hayden's loved ones and the ongoing investigation, there will be no further comment at this time. That's a carefully constructed legal statement. It's not a denial of anything specific. It's not an account of what happened in that apartment. It's a request for the public to let the process play out, paired with a reference to the autopsy's finding on physical trauma specifically, which is accurate as far as it goes, but which doesn't actually address the question the DEA's involvement has raised about medication and its source. Zach Hickerson, Brian's brother, put out his own statement through TMZ, and I think it's worth including because it reflects a family under genuine, visible strain trying to navigate an impossible situation in real time. Out of respect for her loved ones, the speculation and sensationalism of her death needs to end until the facts can be released from the investigation. I understand that request. I think it's a reasonable one coming from someone who was in that room, who apparently watched paramedics work to save someone he cared about, and who is now watching the internet turn that experience into content. I also think there's a difference between sensationalized speculation, inventing details that aren't documented, assigning guilt based on nothing but instinct, and carefully examining what has actually been confirmed through police reports, coroner statements, and federal agency involvement. I've tried, throughout this video, to stay firmly on the second side of that line. Here's where this investigation actually stands. As of everything currently public, an autopsy has been completed, finding no signs of physical trauma. Toxicology results are pending and typically take weeks. The DEA is actively assisting the Greenville Police Department specifically on the medication and substance angle. A police report exists, heavily redacted, documenting a specific behavioral observation from the responding officer about differing emotional reactions between the two men present. And body camera footage from that officer's response exists, has not been released, and, given standard practice for active investigations, particularly ones now involving a federal agency, likely won't be released publicly until this investigation reaches some kind of formal conclusion. I don't think that footage is being hidden in the sinister sense some corners of the internet are already suggesting. I think it's being held the way evidence in an active, federally assisted death investigation typically gets held, not released to the public until investigators have determined it's appropriate to do so, whether that's because charges are filed, because the case is closed with no findings of wrongdoing, or because a formal cause of death is announced that resolves the central question this investigation exists to answer. But I also don't think it's dishonest to say that footage matters enormously, and that when it eventually does become public, through a formal legal proceeding, through a records request once the investigation closes, or through some other channel, it's likely to answer questions that a redacted paragraph and a coroner's brief statement simply can't. Hayden Panettiere spent her career and a significant portion of her public life outside of it being open about struggles that a lot of people recognize themselves in. Addiction, postpartum depression, mental health challenges she discussed candidly at a time when very few public figures did. I think that honesty is part of why this story has resonated as widely and as painfully as it has this week. People feel like they knew her in the specific way audiences sometimes do with performers who let them see something real. Whatever the toxicology results eventually show, whatever the DEA's involvement ultimately uncovers about that bag of medication, and whatever that body camera footage eventually reveals when it does become public, those are the answers this investigation actually exists to find. Not internet speculation, not behavioral analysis performed by strangers watching from thousands of miles away, reading a police officer's 2 documented sentences and building an entire narrative around them. I'll be honest with you, I don't know what happened inside that apartment. Nobody watching this video does. And I'd be doing you a disservice if I pretended otherwise just to give this story a cleaner ending than the facts currently support. What I do know is that the pieces currently on the table, the autopsy, the redacted medication list, the DEA's involvement, the documented behavioral observation, and yes, that unreleased footage, don't yet add up to an answer. They add up to a genuinely active, genuinely serious investigation, being conducted by people with access to information the rest of us simply don't have yet. We'll be here when that footage, or that toxicology report, or whatever comes next in this investigation, actually becomes public. Subscribe to this channel if you want to follow it with us, carefully and honestly, the same way we've tried to approach every difficult case on this channel.